Take a deep breath and listen. By the end of this reflection, you may begin to see that your profound isolation is not a punishment. It is a sacred clearing, a holy doorway calling you back to a living trust. For so long, you have been surrounded by people, entrenched in systems that demanded your constant presence and perfect compliance. But lately, a deep, unsettling quiet has descended upon your life. The relationships that once anchored you have begun to fall away, one by one. You find yourself standing in what feels like an empty, echoing room, entirely alone. You are someone who has always sought connection, someone who poured your heart into belonging to a spiritual community that promised to be your family. To watch those ties dissolve, to feel the sudden chill of their absence, can feel like a devastating failure. It feels as though the ground you built your life upon has crumbled, leaving you stranded in an isolating silence. You might have spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this deep isolation is a sign that you have failed. The silence around you feels heavy, carrying the unspoken accusation that you have somehow done something terribly wrong. You wonder if this profound loneliness is a punishment from the divine for simply outgrowing the spaces that once held you, for daring to ask questions they told you were forbidden. But what if this silence is exactly where the heavy expectations of others finally fall away, making room for your truest self to emerge? Chosen one, you are not being punished. The terrible fear that you have been abandoned by God is not the voice of the divine. It is the lingering echo of a system that taught you to equate their approval with God's presence. They convinced you that walking alone meant walking away from grace. But your current isolation is not an exile. It is an extraction from a deeply toxic environment. They handed you an image of a God who acts like a cosmic scorekeeper, a distant deity who abandons you the moment you stop performing for the crowd. You were taught to fear a supernatural judge who sits on a high throne, meticulously tracking your every misstep and waiting to withdraw his blessing if you dare to step out of line. Marcus Borg's work points us toward the realization that the supernatural, distant judge who demands conformity is often a human invention, constructed to keep us terrified of walking alone. This terrifying image of God was used as an invisible fence, designed to keep you inside their carefully controlled boundaries. If you believed that God would only love you as long as you remained within their group, you would never dare to leave, no matter how much they drained your spirit. The religious system you escaped relied entirely on this false image of God to maintain its power over you. They took the sacred name of the divine and twisted it into a weapon of manipulation, using it to enforce their own strict rules of who was acceptable and who was rejected. They told you that if you lost their fellowship, you were losing your salvation. They framed their conditional love as divine truth, making you believe that your spiritual worth was entirely dependent on your ability to conform to their expectations. But this distant judge was never the divine voice. It was simply the megaphone they used to keep your beautiful spirit trapped in the fear of rejection. They used your deep, earnest desire to please God as the very chain that kept you bound to their exhausting demands. And so, you stayed. You stayed in relationships that quietly crushed your soul because you were terrified of what would happen if you walked away. The fear of being entirely alone was so overwhelming that you compromised your own inner knowing, silencing your intuition to keep the peace. You dimmed your own light to avoid threatening their fragile authority. But, wounded believer, you must recognize that the emptiness you feel right now is the necessary consequence of finally choosing your own spiritual survival. The pain of this isolation is real, but it is the pain of a bone being set back into place, not the pain of it being broken. The fear that currently grips your heart is simply the withdrawal from a system of control that you no longer need. You are standing in the quiet clearing, and though it is terrifying, it is the first true breath of freedom you have taken in years. When the noise of manipulation finally fades, the silence that replaces it can be deafening. It is easy to mistake this silence for the absence of the divine. But let us look at the ancient stories, the sacred narratives of those who walked this path before you. Consider the prophet Elijah, as recorded in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. Elijah was utterly exhausted, running for his life from those who sought to destroy him, fleeing the intense, manipulative powers of his day. He collapsed in the deep wilderness, feeling entirely alone and asking simply to be let go. He sought God in the dramatic, performative displays of power, the great wind, the earth-shattering quake, the consuming fire. He expected the divine to appear in the loud, undeniable ways he had always been taught. But the sacred presence was not in the chaos or the noise. The divine met Elijah in the sound of sheer silence. Marcus Borg taught the principle that God is the encompassing spirit, the sacred presence in whom we live, move, and have our being. This panentheistic vision completely changes how we experience the wilderness. You were told that God only speaks in the loud, crowded fires of religious certainty, and that if you are not in the center of the noise, you are far from grace. But what if the sacred is the quiet, encompassing breath holding you right now, wrapping around your lonely shoulders in the sheer silence of the wilderness? The divine is not a distant judge, watching you suffer from afar. The divine is the very space in which you are resting. You do not have to perform, you do not have to shout, and you do not have to prove your worth to access this presence. In your deep isolation, the encompassing spirit is closer to you than your own heartbeat. But quiet your heart, beloved one. You must gently examine the stirrings of your spirit in this quiet place. Do not confuse the quiet, sober clarity of spiritual discernment, which clears away toxic noise, with the reactive anger of your past wounds that demands permanent isolation. The pain of your past may try to convince you that all connection is dangerous, that you must build thick walls and never let anyone in again. But true discernment brings peace and prepares you to love again, even as you rest in this solitary clearing. The encompassing spirit is not calling you to be bitter. The spirit is calling you to be healed. You are setting boundaries not to punish those who hurt you, but to protect the sacred garden of your own soul so that new, healthy life can eventually grow. As you sit in this clearing, you must also reckon with the heavy burdens you carry from the past. For so long, you felt crushed by scriptures used as weapons, thrown at you to demand you return to the toxic systems you outgrew. The Bible was handed to you as a rigid manual of compliance, a list of demands used to induce guilt and enforce your submission to the group. You were taught to read the ancient texts as a constant reminder of your own inadequacy, a voice that always agreed with your manipulators and never offered you true refuge. But let us re-see the ancient journey. Look at the path of the Israelites, described in Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18. When they were finally freed from the crushing slavery of Egypt, God did not lead them on the shortest, most direct route to their destination. The direct route would have led them straight into war, into battles they were too fragile to fight. Instead, the divine presence led them on a long detour through the wilderness. This isolation, this long period of wandering away from the crowds, was not a punishment for a lack of faith. It was a necessary protective pacing. It was the divine acknowledging their trauma and giving them the space they needed to molt, to shed the mindset of slavery before they could step into their freedom. Your current isolation is this very same detour. In Borg's framework, the Bible is a sacrament of the sacred window through which the light of the divine shines, to be taken seriously, but not literally. When we stop viewing Scripture as a rule book for manipulation, it becomes a powerful testament to the healing process. What if these ancient texts were open windows, inviting you to see that your wilderness detour is a place of profound divine protection? You are not wandering aimlessly. You are being carefully guided through a sacred clearing process. The encompassing spirit is allowing the old, limiting factors of your life to fall away so that you can emerge stronger. The words of the text are not chains to bind you, but maps showing you that everyone who has ever sought true freedom has had to pass through the quiet, transformative space of the wilderness. And in this wilderness, you are not without a guide. Consider the story found in the 42nd chapter of Job. Job sat utterly alone on an ash heap, stripped of his wealth, his health, and his family. In his deepest vulnerability, the relationships that remained proved to be toxic. His friends surrounded him not to comfort him, but to judge him, using their rigid theology to insist that his suffering was a punishment for hidden sins. They demanded he confess and conform to their neat, transactional view of God. But Job refused to perform. He let those relationships fracture rather than abandon his own integrity. And ultimately, it was Job, sitting in the ashes, who encountered the awe-inspiring mystery of the divine, while the friends who clung to their rigid systems were rebuked. Borg's reading of Jesus helps us see him as a Jewish spirit mystic whose core message shattered the purity systems of his day, replacing them with radical compassion. Jesus did not respect the artificial boundaries that the religious elites used to decide who was acceptable and who was outcast. He intentionally walked away from the centers of religious power and sought out those who had been pushed into the wilderness. Jesus understood that the systems demanding absolute conformity were fundamentally opposed to the liberating love of the encompassing Spirit. He dismantled the walls of religious performance, proving that divine favor is not found in the applause of the crowd, but in the quiet, compassionate spaces of genuine connection. Jesus did not come to build a higher wall of religious performance or to force you to stay in relationships that drain your energy. He came to dissolve those walls entirely, inviting you to step away from the crowd that judges you and walk into a space of solitary, radical transformation. When your old relationships fall away, you are simply walking the path that Jesus walked, the path of leaving behind the rigid structures of the past to embrace a truer, deeper compassion. Child of God, chosen one, your isolation is the holy ground where the false self is dismantled. You are being invited to stop trying to fit into spaces that were always too small for the vastness of your spirit, and instead, to stand tall in the freedom of your own authentic, divinely loved existence. As the old layers of your life peel away, a profound sense of disorientation often sets in. They convinced you that walking away and standing alone meant you were losing your faith, because they equated faith with absolute agreement to their rules and constant participation in their group. Your departure feels, at first, like a catastrophic spiritual failure. You look at the empty space around you and wonder if you have made a terrible mistake. The fear whispers that without the structure, without the crowd, and without their constant validation, you will simply drift away into the abyss. You are grieving not just the loss of people, but the loss of the certainty they provided. But Marcus Borg once wrote that faith is not about intellectual certainty or holding on to rigid dogmas with white knuckles. Faith is fiducia, a deep letting go, like floating on the deep sea of God's goodness. Faith is not blindly agreeing with the crowd. It is the quiet courage to let your old, heavy shell break and trust that the vast sea of God's grace will hold your new weight. What you are experiencing is not the death of your faith, but its true beginning. You are transitioning from a faith based on fear and compliance to a faith based on deep, abiding trust. You are learning to stop fighting the current and to simply let the encompassing Spirit carry you. This letting go is terrifying because it requires you to surrender control, but it is the only way to discover the true depth of the divine love that supports you. This empty space, this profound solitude, is not a tragedy. It is the necessary womb of your rebirth. In nature, when a creature molts, it must retreat into absolute isolation. It sheds its old, restrictive shell and waits in the darkness, utterly vulnerable, until its new, stronger armor hardens. You are in the molting season. The circumstances that created this vacuum in your life were not accidents. They were the sacred clearing necessary to purify you of the limiting factors that held you back. The relationships that fell away were the old shell that could no longer contain the person you are becoming. Do not rush to fill the silence. Let the darkness do its holy work. Let the emptiness clear your vision and prepare your heart for the brilliant light that is about to break through. You have survived the hardest part of the journey. The intense pain of separation is beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady strength you never knew you possessed. The solitude that once terrified you has become a sanctuary, a place where you can finally hear your own voice without the deafening interference of others' expectations. The isolation has completed its sacred task. It has burned away the need for external validation and forged within you a resilient, independent spirit. You are no longer the frightened person who needed the crowd to tell you who you were. You have emerged from the wilderness fundamentally changed, bearing the quiet confidence of someone who has met the divine in the deepest silence and lived to tell the tale. Chosen one, your silent season has cleared the path for your true light to shine. You are safe now, held in an unconditional love that requires absolutely no performance. You do not have to rebuild the walls that confined you. You simply have to rest in the vast, open space of belonging that the encompassing Spirit has prepared for you. As we close our time together, I want you to listen to the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. What is the old, heavy expectation you are finally ready to leave behind in this quiet wilderness? If you feel a gentle peace rising in your heart, if you are ready to embrace the beautiful, independent version of yourself that is emerging from the silence, I invite you, one learning to trust again, to write, "I am learning to trust again," in the comments below. May you walk in the quiet strength of your own soul, knowing you belong eternally to the sacred.